Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to Versus Stars podcast. All my loyal listeners, thank you for your continued support. And remember, click the subscribe button, everybody. This is an amazing episode because Caleb Palmquist boards the mothership. He's the writer of Unicorn Vampire Hunter and Space Monkey Knights Go, both now on Kickstarter. Come aboard as we go traversing the stars. Hello, Mr. Palmquist. Thank you so much for coming to Versus Stars podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Totally my pleasure. So we start off with a question of inspiration. So inspire your love of comics and who are your earliest influences?
Oh boy, I mean, the first comic I fell in love with was Ultimate X-Men because I was given some when I was a kid. And I would say my biggest influence in among professional comic book writers is Brian K. Vaughan, for sure.
That guy is absolutely amazing. Why the Last Man? He also did one. What the hell is the name of the one? Pride of Baghdad is one of my favorite books I think I've read. That guy is tremendous. He is a long time bucket list. Yes, I've been trying to get for a long time.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. Yeah.
So you currently have two projects on Kickstarter right now. So how are you balancing two projects? Because it seems insane to try to do two at the same time because most of us can barely carry one.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. I don't know that I'll do it again. The one is Unicorn Vampire Hunter Volume 1, and that was one that honestly is I knew was going to do well because it's my most successful book. This is my sixth Kickstarter for Unicorn Vampire Hunter, so I knew that, there was a following there. And then the other one is called Space Monkey Knights Go, which I co-created with Dave Lentz. And that book is a brand new book. It's untested. I think in the future, if I'm going to launch, especially help somebody else launch a new property, this is like very much a collaboration. I would want to do it on its own. I think my theory was that if I launched at the same time as mine, there's some cross promo there. But really what happened is I wasn't able to give my full engine, my full marketing attention to it in the same way that I might have been able to if it was my only book. So yeah, I think to answer your question sort of poorly. Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously you've been very successful with Kickstarter, especially with, like I said, the Unicorn series, which is a difficult beast. Crowdfunding is difficult. It just is in every facet is difficult. Marketing, all the time and energy, everything else. What is the key then to making a successful Kickstarter?
Oh man, I don't know. That's a good question. I wish that I knew. I have lots of little tips and tricks that I've learned over the course of about 4 or 5 years of doing Kickstarter. And consistency. I think if I could boil it down to one thing that was the key, it would be consistency. Make the books, get them out to people, be honest, and then make another book and get it out to people. I think some of my a lot of my fan base has come from the fact that I've put out issues pretty quickly, is relative to, certainly not fast relative to like what your typical Spider-Man comic comes out like once a month. I'm nowhere close to that, but I'm putting out 2, sometimes 3 issues of a book a year, which is faster than the typical speed on Kickstarter, I think. And so people can expect that they'll get more of the story from me if they back a book of mine.
So like I said, you're the writer of Unicorn Vampire Hunter. So what inspired the concept?
Well, I've always really been into unicorns. I have a poster of a unicorn that I have had since I was 6 years old. It's just like a unicorn standing on a cliff in front of a castle. There's like a rainbow behind it. And I had that poster since I was 6, and I took it everywhere with me. I took it to college. I took it when I moved into my first place, and I'm married now and I own a house, but in my office there's the poster just right outside this room. And I also really like vampires. I'm a huge Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan. I know that Joss Whedon is now kind of a curse word, but I love Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I love vampires in general. And so this was an opportunity to combine those things. And then the sort of the third influence there is fairy tales.
Mm.
I love fairy tales in general. Like Neil Gaiman's Stardust is one of
No,
my favorites.
fantastic.
Yeah. And so I wanted to tell my own fairy tale, and so I just, it's like Powerpuff Girls, right? Like you take all the things that you like and you put it in a pot and you stir it up, and that's what I got.
So, I mean, there are a lot of vampire stories that are out there, in the world. So, how do you differentiate yours from the noise that's out there on vampires?
Well, as far as I know, mine's the only one in which a unicorn kills the vampires.
Yes. So, when you have all those fantastical elements to a story like this, how do you ground it for the readers?
Well, all of my comics, I like to think, are about characters. And they're about uh, real things that real people go through. In
Mm.
Unicorn Vampire Hunter, the characters go like there's friendships that get hurt because of miscommunications. There are families that are forged, like found families, people who are not biological families who come together.
Mm.
There's daddy issues in the book. There's all sorts of real human conflict that create the core of what the book is. And I think that hopefully the high concept of unicorns and vampires is what draws people in, but then like the real human stakes of the book and the emotional beats are what keep people interested.
Now, when dealing with a fantastical world, how are you balancing characterization with world building? Because world building is kind of like its own thing on its, and the weight of that can sometimes overtake a story. So how are you balancing the two?
Well, with Unicorn Vampire Hunter, I think in some ways I'm lucky and in some ways I'm lazy because essentially it's set in like a generic fantasy world. Now, as I've told more of the story, I've built out the specifics of what that world looks like, but it's like intentionally designed to be a world where you would expect anything from a fantasy book to show up. If a werewolf showed up in the pages of Unicorn Vampire Hunter, you wouldn't be surprised.
Mm.
If goblins showed up, you wouldn't be surprised. If there's an evil witch or a mad king, these are things that from the genre we expect to see. And so in that way, that's part of why the setting appealed to me because I wanted to really have the chance to dig into the characters and not have to spend a lot of time doing world building. There are moments in the comic where there are world building things where I take a moment to explain how the magic works or how the transformations work or whatever, but it's very light on that.
Mm.
So I would say it's if you're like a Brandon Sanderson fan, then I would put this more on the soft magic side of things rather than the hard magic side. Like I do very little like intense explaining of how the world works or how the magic works or anything like that because that's not what the story is about.
Mm. Well, obviously your protagonist is Edward otherwise the unicorn, who's for readers who don't know, he's sometimes Edward, sometimes the unicorn. So to make sure it's clear, so they know who I'm talking about. So what makes him the perfect vampire hunter?
Well, so there's a couple of things. The non-spoiler version is that he's the last unicorn in the world, and unicorns have a vampire stake right on their heads. The slightly spoiler version, this is like a little bit spoiler of issue 1, is that he was prophesized to be the greatest warrior in the world as a human, and his father, the king, trained him to be the greatest warrior in the world. So he was already the like highly trained expert warrior before he ever became a unicorn.
Mm.
And so not only does he have a unicorn stake on his head, he is also destined and trained to be an incredible warrior.
So what does that do to a person when someone tells you you're going to be the greatest ever was? I mean, it's one thing to be just reach your goals, those are to be told you are in fact going to be the greatest. What does that do to him as a person?
Oh, it does a lot to him. I mean, In fact, issue 4 of the series is basically all about that. I mean, if you anyone out there who has parents who really put a lot of high expectations on them can probably relate to that. And um, it is it made him driven, but
Yeah.
also bitter and jealous. And so he was someone who was always vying for his father's attention and love. Um, and never felt like he could get it. So definitely it created a whole host of psychological issues for him.
Well, once you have a prophecy that especially says that you're the greatest of all time, you run into questions of fate. How does that interact with the world? If he is prophesized to be this, does that mean he will be this thing, whether or not he works towards it or not, or how much of it is a destiny that he controls, or for better or worse, let's just say.
That's a good question. I think in the comic, he doesn't really try to thwart his destiny. Um, I would say that once he runs away from what his father wants, he only further falls into the the path of becoming the greatest warrior. And I think that um, so it's a good question. It's not something I like totally examine um in the book. I mean, there's definitely a concept of like he doesn't want to be the thing that his dad wants him to be,
Hmm.
but also because he's rejecting his father's wishes and because of who his father trained him to be, both of those things, like sort of in a dichotomy, are both driving him toward that destiny.
Hmm. And one of the themes in the book in the series seems to be transformation because we have without giving too much of a twist, something happens with Jezebel as well in issue 4. So how long was that story be planned out for?
Oh, that was one of the oldest, that was one of the very first things I wrote. So I actually wrote this story as just a little fairy tale for fun on some notebook paper way back in 2011.
Mm,
And I still have that original version. It's like 10 pages of like yellow notebook paper that I hand wrote on. But um, it was always my intention for Jezebel to go undergo that transformation and have that. Now my original version was much more tragic. When I originally wrote it, I envisioned it more like a grim fairy tale where it was like way darker ending.
mm,
Um, but I ended up changing that for a number of reasons. One, I wanted to continue the story, so you can't just have everyone die at the end. But also, I had some very specific ideas for where I wanted the story to go and the tone that I wanted to set with the story. So yeah, I always envisioned that twist, um, for sure.
I'm not sure how much information you want us to give on that twist. I mean, yeah, obviously the
Well,
series
sure.
completed.
We can tell people Jezebel becomes a vampire.
Yes.
At some point in the story she gets kidnapped and she gets turned into a vampire. And um obviously that is dreadful for Edward because he is the vampire hunter and Jezebel is someone that he loves very dearly.
Mm. So when you have this change in her from into being a vampire, obviously without giving too much away, she doesn't die in the series. How does that impact her going forward now that she experienced what it is to be a vampire? Not only to be a vampire, but considering she's working, she has Edward, they're hunting these vampires, she's now experienced what it is to be one. What does
Mhm.
that do to her psychologically? What does that have to do with her perspective on that?
Well, so when I originally wrote the story, Jezebel was like written as sort of the personification of innocence, like naivety and innocence. And I when I started making it a comic, I definitely wanted to like expand what her character was.
Mm,
But she starts out very innocent. I mean, she starts out being sent by her parents to go live in the marsh with her uncle, and because they think that the city is dangerous, and they don't want her exposed to those dangers. But of course, throughout the series, that innocence is tested. Um, and in the very first issue, she gets into trouble because she's so naive and
mm.
so innocent, and she just trusts that this guy that she encounters in the woods is like friendly and genuinely wants to be her friend. But of course, he's a vampire. Um, and but as the story goes on, she loses some of that innocence, but never really loses her resolve. And so
Mm,
the arc of her character is like, how can you maintain an optimism while also learning about the harsh truths of the world? And is there a version of an innocent person where they are come up against the harsh realities of the world and come out of it determined more than ever to see the good in the world rather
mm.
than being destroyed by it?
Now, one thing, the scene from issue 5 where the vampire is talking to Jezebel, and she's talking about, and he's talking about the hunger that you have and the drive that you have to eat and everything else. Does does that when she eventually turns back from being that, is there sympathy for what those are, and does that impact her need to want to kill them because now she recognizes there's something, there is a need that how much they can potentially control this drive.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think that my goal, without giving away too much for the plans of the future of the series, my goal has always been to um make the vampire characters into sympathetic characters, which
Mm,
but I didn't want to do that in a way that was unearned.
mm,
Um and so the the vampires, especially Enrique, who's the main vampire, has a tragic backstory of his own. I mean, in issue 3, we see what happens when he first becomes a vampire, and the relationship that he has with his brother and what his motivations are. And so yeah, I mean, I think I wanted to instill some amount of sympathy for like, oh, these vampires, they don't really have a choice. Like, they
mm,
are driven by this hunger, and what does that, what does that mean,
mm,
um, for who they are? Um, and so, yeah, I mean, the promise of the book for me is that the villains are complex,
mm.
that there's a lot to them, and they're not straight up cackling, mustache twirling villains.
And I mean, I don't know if it's intentional or unintentional, but it feels like there's a theme of um being driven by things out of control. The hero, Edward, is being driven by fate and prophecy. The vampires are being driven by hunger. They both, in my opinion, share that same kind of sense that there's something beyond necessarily themselves that's pushing them forward. Was that something you were going with or not?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think everyone, like, we're all we're all stuck on this planet, and we all have whatever lot we were given in life, right?
Mm,
Like, there's certain things that are just beyond your control, where you came from, who you are, what you look like. I mean, everything from your eye color to your sexuality to everything in between, right? Like, there are certain things that just make up who we are. Um, and you know, and so I think, yeah, I think that there is a lot. I mean, that's very insightful. The
mm,
idea that Edward is driven by a thing and the vampires are driven by another thing, and how much is like what, like, their own agency in there.
mm.
I think that's very insightful.
Oh, thank you. Pat myself on the back right there. Good job. So once again, without giving too much away, the series is set up for more stories, obviously based on where the last one ends. Given the situation, without getting too many details, how much of a part is Edward going to play in the upcoming issues? Given how the last series kind of ends.
How much is Edward going to play a part?
Yeah.
Big part. Um, for those, I won't say what happens in the end of issue 5, but Edward is separated from Jezebel and Seamus.
Mm,
Now, the second arc, the volume 2, is going to have a little bit of like a little bit of a uh of like two plot lines diverging. Like Obi-Wan Kenobi going off on his own adventure, right? While the
mm,
other characters are doing something else. Well, they're trying to make their way back to each other. Edward is trying to make his way back to Jezebel and Seamus, and Jezebel and Seamus are trying to make their way to Edward. And so there's going to be this split. So there will be a lot of time spent with Edward, but there will also be a lot of time spent with Jezebel and Seamus. So
mm.
I think that percentage-wise, we'll probably see Edward less than we did in volume 1. But he is still very much the main character. It's just that Jezebel and Seamus are stepping up into also more of a main character role
Mm.
in volume 2. So yes, he's not just going to be out of the book. He's definitely still a major part, and we're the place that he went, we are going. Issue 1 of volume 2, that's issue 6, is right there with Edward. So so we're going to be exploring a whole new place and a whole new thing happening there, and I'm very excited for that.
Do we know when the second volume is going to start?
Yeah, so as we speak right now, I'm buttoning up, crossing the T's on the script for issue 6, and Daryl, who is the artist, is going to be starting on it next month in July. He's going to be drawing it. And then we are going to do another Kickstarter that's 2 issues. We did that for issue 4 and 5, and we're going to do that again for issue 6 and 7. So once issue 7 gets started, we'll do another Kickstarter, and that will probably be early next year. I would imagine. I think that part of the like hyperactive part of my brain that wants to do more and more and more is like, well, maybe we could fit it in this year, but I think that might be overly ambitious. Certainly by early next year, we'll be seeing issue 6 and 7 on Kickstarter, so you won't have to wait long. I can also say that there is going to be a secret bonus Unicorn Vampire Hunter story coming before that, which if you're following along with what I'm doing, you'll see it announced soon enough. And yeah, so yeah, it won't be too long. Issue 6 and 7 are coming. We're in the process of making sure that the whole second arc and the third arc are ready. It's going to be 12 more issues, at least, of story that we have planned out of where all these characters are going. I'm very excited, and I'm confident that we'll get through all those issues because the support has really been there, which is awesome.
So, what are the dates in which the campaign is active for this one?
Oh, sure. Let me take a look. It's going to end on July 13th. So I believe that it ends at July 13th at like 11 p.m. Pacific time, which ends up being like 1 p.m. or 2 p.m. on the 14th Eastern time, depending on where you live. But yeah, July 13th is when it's scheduled to end.
Well, you're also the writer of, or co-creator and writer of Space Monkey Nights Go, which is a fantastic title, by the way.
Thank
So,
you.
what drew you to this concept, and fans of which stories will love this one?
Okay, so Space Monkey Nights Go was something that Dave Lentz, my letterer, brought to me. And this was like 3 or 4 years ago. A long time. Time flies, man. He came to me and he had this idea. Basically, he really likes things like Powerpuff Girls, Voltron, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Well, Powerpuff Girls is probably more my influence. He's about 10 years older than me, so he was like 80s cartoons,
Yeah.
and I was more like 90s, early 2000s cartoons. But he really liked the Saturday morning cartoon thing, and he had this idea called Space Monkey Nights Go. Later, we found out that there's like a Disney cartoon that has a very similar title.
Mm.
We didn't find that out until we were deep into production, but it shows how much research we did. But anyway, so it's about 4 monkeys who are sent out into space to the far reaches of space. They're in cryopods and they're supposed to be learning all of mankind's knowledge while they sleep. But instead, the robot in charge of making sure they get that information becomes obsessed with King Arthur's knights and only feeds them information into their heads about King Arthur's knights. So they crash land and they wake up believing themselves to be knights of the Round Table, and then they become guardians of the universe as the Space Monkey Knights.
That sounds awesome. So, as you mentioned, they become heroes based on Arthurian legends. So, is this a commentary on the power of story?
Oh man, you're with the hard hitting questions, Jeff. Um, so That's a great question. I mean, that's deeper than I thought about it. I will say that I love King Arthur, King Arthur's Knights. I wrote a whole comic book that's actually an adaptation of a classic King Arthur story. That's a different comic that I did. Um, but yeah, I mean that's a great take on it. I mean, I think that these monkeys were inspired by the stories that they heard. Um, so it totally could be that.
So, do these monkeys come from a world of monkeys?
No,
Okay.
we don't really explain it in the comic, but in my mind, they came from our world. They came from Earth.
Okay.
Just like a slightly more future version of Earth, but they were uh, yeah. So I don't think they come from a world of monkeys.
So there's no monkey King Arthur running around back in the
There,
day.
no, I don't think there's a monkey King Arthur. I think there was a they were told the versions of King Arthur stories that we know. Um, so yeah.
Because I mean, is it do they then envision those stories as being monkeys because they're monkeys, sort of like was it Blade Runner to what do they call it to electric was it Dream of Electric Sheep, the robots Dream of
All
Electric
right.
Sheep kind of situation, or do they know that these are human told stories at some point?
That's a good question, and I don't know that it's a question that we're necessarily going to examine. It's interesting that because Dave and I have talked about how like there's a lot of children's cartoons that are really dumb. He he's got a young kid, and I've got nieces
Yeah,
who are really into the show that we recently talked about was PJ Masks. I don't
yeah,
know if you're familiar with this, but
no.
it's um it's this cartoon about kids who when at night they turn into superheroes. Their PJs turn into superheroes, and then they fight crime. And like that's it. There's no more explanation to it at all. And like the plot is like very thin. I mean, it's like, and so we were like, okay, we're making essentially a children's book, but we want to have it be like a little smarter than that. That said, we're also leaning into the idea of like Saturday morning cartoons where they like
Mm,
explain the origin in the theme song, and then that's all you get. Um, and then, you know, like
right.
if you read like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle comics, for example, you're going to get like a lot more explanation of like where they came from and what they are and everything. But most of the cartoon versions are don't go deep into the origin. They're like,
Mm.
okay, they got dropped into the ooze and they turned into mutants and now they eat pizza with Splinter. Let's go fight some crime. Uh, and so that's kind of the vibe we were going for. So hopefully we can play off of that, and then the depth of the comic comes more from the characters and
Mm.
like what they do, and less on like explaining how they got where they are. Because I mean, ultimately, in the end, this is a comic about four monkeys who are wearing like Voltron style super suits, fighting evil alien wasps, to protect innocent people in the galaxy. So like trying to get too deep into explaining like how or why, um, I think ends up just feeling a little silly.
So does this campaign run at the same times as Unicorn Vampire Hunter, same dates?
Exactly the same time.
That is amazing. Well, Mr. Palmquist,
Thank you.